Well, let me wish a good afternoon to all of our viewers here in the United States. Good evening to those joining us from Germany and elsewhere in Europe, and welcome to everyone, wherever you are, who has come together with us today for this webinar. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And we're very excited to bring this discussion to you today. We are focusing on foreign policy and the German election that will take place on September 26th, just a few months from now. This is the 7th webinar in our series focused on the German election, and there are more to come. So we hope that you will all come back and join us for future discussions as well. We are in the last months of Angela Merkel's term as Chancellor of Germany. She's not running for re-election. The election race, for those of you who have been following it, is quite tight, and there are a number of possible coalition outcomes. And our discussion today will help us get a sense of how foreign policy views are shifting in Germany and what we might be able to expect in the future. And I think for any government that takes shape in Germany, foreign policy will be one of the top challenges. And we've been reminded of this by President Biden and Chancellor Merkel in their speeches at the virtual Munich Security Conference a few months ago. So we are delighted to have a world-class collection of expertise with us here today. I'm going to turn the floor over to our moderator, Dr. Gail Maddox, who directs the Foreign and Security Policy Program at AICGS. And before I do, I just want to thank our partners in this endeavor: the BMW Center at Georgetown University, Aston University in the United Kingdom, and the International Association for the Study of German Politics. I also want to thank the German Embassy in Washington, D.C. for their support that helps make this event possible. So with that, Gail Maddox, over to you, and you will lead us through our discussion today. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and welcome to all. Thank you, Jeff. And it's with pleasure that I moderate this discussion with the three speakers that we have for today. Our topic is a new direction, ? German foreign and security policy. And it's part of, as Jeff Rathke just mentioned, the election series that AICGS is doing and is led by Eric Langenbacher from Georgetown University. And AICGS, of course. The fall Bundestag election will usher in a German government under a new chancellor and a yet unknown coalition of parties. As a new Biden administration has experienced a return to traditional alliances and other more traditional policies, the incoming German government likely will chart a new course in foreign and security policy, if gradually, after 16 years of the Merkel chancellorship. The challenges that undoubtedly will accompany those potential changes will be our webinar focus today. At the 2014 Munich Security Conference, President Gauck urged a more active role and greater responsibility for Germany and in Europe and internationally, including foreign policy and security operations. I would argue that such a shift has been occurring. Note the German response to the Crimean annexation, the Normandy Group and Ukraine, Afghanistan, many other issues where Germany took a position of strong leadership. But of course, this hasn't solved all of our issues. Even as we speak, in Europe, Russia has been massing troops at the Ukrainian border. Nord Stream 2 is barreling toward completion in the Baltics, even as the debate over its operation continues. In the Pacific, arguments on a potential cover-up over the roots of the COVID-19 pandemic have surfaced, while ever-present arguments over Taiwan and North Korea, as well as China's activities on the disputed South China Sea islands, continue to challenge the region. This is not to mention that both Russia and China have also, during this period, pursued military modernization. How will these challenges impact the direction a new coalition might take? A more active role in the Asia Pacific and changes in the transatlantic arena. And so I would like to turn then to introduce briefly our three very expert speakers to consider the direction of a new coalition, be that what it is, and in Germany, and where it will go after the Merkel era comes to an end. Our first speaker will be Professor Angela Stent. She is a foremost Russian expert who directs the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. She as well has held several government positions, which are on your invitation. And Angela has an impressive scholar as well on Germany. Most of you have probably seen and hopefully read Russia and Germany Reborn. And her most recent in last year was Putin's World, Russia Against the West and the Rest, which received terrific reviews. Ambassador Peter Wittig is a 5-time ambassador and represented Germany in the United Nations, in the UN, and in the UK. He's currently the Ruth Bader Horwath Ambassador in Residence at Georgetown University, a Fisher Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he advises a major German company. Robert Zoellick is a senior counselor at Brunswick Geopolitical and a senior fellow at the Belford Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's been president of the World Bank, U.S. Trade Representative, Deputy Secretary of State, Undersecretary of State, White House Deputy Chief of Staff, among other positions. Most recently, he published America in the World, a history of U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy, which I'd highly recommend to you. So with that introduction, let me turn to Professor Stent and ask her to take the floor and comment on Russia in this debate. Thank you, Angela. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Gail, and thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. As you mentioned, Russia, of course, has become in the past few weeks even more of a challenge than it's been for some time. The recent hijacking of an EU civilian plane by the Lukashenko regime in Belarus has brought into sharp focus the challenges which both the US and Europe face in dealing with Russia. This was an act of state-sponsored piracy, which threatened the safety of all the passengers on board. It demonstrated that Belarus will go to any lengths to pursue its opponents who live in exile. President Putin has backed Lukashenko. Last week, he warned the outside world that foreign enemies are trying to bite a juicy piece off Russia, and he responded, "We will knock your teeth out." The EU has imposed sanctions on Belarus, but neither Brussels nor Washington have taken any actions against Russia on this particular issue. And of course, as you know, President Biden and President Putin will meet in Geneva on June 16th for their first summit. I'm going to focus my remarks on German-Russian relations and the German elections, but I will begin by reminding you of how US-German cooperation on dealing with Russia is developing at the moment. The Biden administration, in contrast to the Trump administration, came into office determined to mend relations with Germany and to pursue, as much as it could, a common policy with Germany in dealing with Russia. The most concrete example of this we saw just recently, the waiver given to Nord Stream 2 CEO Matthias Warnig and his company during the latest round of US sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. As President Biden said last week, the pipeline's nearly completed, and it's much more important to cultivate good relations with our allies. The administration have said that it's not seeking a reset with Russia, but a stable and predictable relationship. But when I parse those words and I listen to both what President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken are saying, it sounds to me sort of like a reset. It depends, it remains to be seen how much, of course, can be accomplished at this Geneva summit, because of course the US-Russian relationship is extremely brittle. In the run-up to the German election, I think Russia is emerging as one of the key foreign policy issues. And I think it represents a somewhat new alignment in German politics. The two pro-Russia parties, the AfD and Die Linke, favor, of course, a forward-looking leaning policy toward Russia. They're against sanctions. They're very, very critical of Ukraine. The CDU, the SPD, and the FDP today all subscribe to what was once the bitterly contested Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt half a century ago. The three parties all support engagement with Russia and recognize the economic interdependence that exists between Russia and Germany, particularly, of course, in the energy field. Now, all three parties have criticized Russia for the annexation of Crimea, the launch of the war in the Donbass, the repression of domestic dissent, the poisoning of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, and before him, the poisoning of the GRU double agent Sergei Skripal in England, and of course, the assassination of a Chechen dissident in the Tiergarten in broad daylight. But they all support dialogue with Russia, and they have been opposed to supplying Ukraine with lethal defensive weaponry. Chancellor Merkel is the Western leader who understands Putin the best. Of course, she grew up in the GDR, she speaks fluent Russian, and she spent many, many hours with Putin, sometimes without interpreters, listening to his, let's say, unique version of events. And of course, she famously told President Obama once that Putin lives in a different world. The one party, however, that has not subscribed to the Ostpolitik consensus is the Greens. Now, of course, they didn't exist when Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik first emerged. The Greens, like all other major political parties, have internal disagreements about Russia, but they've been consistently and actively supporting human rights in Russia. They've been much more openly critical of Russia than any of the other political parties have been. Chancellor candidate Annalena Baerbock has said that if the Greens come to power, they would stop the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, both for political and for climate reasons. She's also said that much more pressure must be put on Russia over Ukraine. And her colleague, Robert Habeck, was last week in Ukraine. He met with President Zelensky, and he said that Germany should supply lethal defensive weaponry to Ukraine, something that Merkel has so far refused to do. He's been roundly criticized for saying this by a number of different political actors, including former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. So in 2021, there is the possibility that the past 50 years of continuity and consensus in German policy toward Russia could be questioned. If Baerbock were to become chancellor, or the Greens were to take, say, the foreign ministry, there could be a hardening of policy toward Russia. But assuming there is a coalition government, and one has to assume that, it's not clear how far the Greens would be able to go to pursue their harder line on Russia. And in fact, what would a harder line look like? That's the other very challenging question for any political party there. Is a harder line more sanctions on Russia? Is it military aid to Ukraine? And up till now, of course, Germany has led the EU's Ostpolitik and all the sanctions that were imposed after 2014. The EU itself remains deeply divided on how to deal with Russia and has no common Ostpolitik. We know that President Macron has been trying to take over the EU leadership of policy toward Russia. He's in favor of a reset. So far, I don't think that his reset has achieved very much. So how does Russia view the German elections? We know that disinformation has appeared about Ms. Baerbock, and that has been attributed to Russia. Election interference is well underway in Germany, and conspiracy theories about her links to George Soros or her plan to have every German school child study the Quran, all of these things have been attributed to entities and people in Russia. Clearly, her stand on Nord Stream 2 and on Ukraine greatly irk Moscow. So I think that we can expect that in the next 3 months, Russia will step up its disinformation campaign, targeting the Greens, but also, I'm sure, targeting some of the other candidates as well. The new German government will face a Russia that's been emboldened to reach out and attack its perceived enemies wherever they are, and to continue cyber and social media interference in the election campaigns of all Western countries. The new German government will be working with a US administration that has stated that it will pursue a dual track policy toward Russia, cooperation on issues of mutual interest, and pushback such as arms control or climate or the Arctic, and then pushback against malign Russian cyber and military activities. If this sounds familiar, it should be. I think this is what the Biden administration is talking about, is a 2021 version of the seminal 1967 NATO Harmel report that, of course, urged a dual-track policy of deterrence and détente with the USSR. And I think most Western countries, particularly Germany and the US, have tried to implement a similar policy, again, for the past more than 50 years. And sometimes those policies have been more successful than at other times and will presumably continue. Now, one of the new interesting elements, again, is climate change. President Putin has belatedly discovered climate change. It'll be interesting to see how much of it's really possible to work with Russia on these issues. And these issues are very important for all German political parties, especially, of course, for the Greens. Other issues, such as Russia's relations with its neighbors, particularly, of course, the conflict in Ukraine, will be much more difficult to deal with. And as the Kremlin increasingly cuts off ties with civil society, it's trying to insulate its own civil society from the outside world. It's going to be much more difficult for Germany, I think, to continue its outreach to the Russian people, which has been very active really since unification. But of course, the strong economic ties will continue to bind the two countries together. Over the decades, Germany has articulated different concepts for trying to deal with Russia. Wandel durch Annäherung, change through rapprochement, the initial Willy Brandt idea. Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. Again, the idea that closer economic ties can have a beneficial effect on political relations. And then when Mr. Steinmeier was foreign minister, Annäherung durch Verflechtung, rapprochement through integration. And then Germany, of course, has led the EU's partnership for modernization with Russia. But of course, that didn't really succeed in achieving what it set out to do. So the question is, will the next German government be able to redefine its ties with Russia in such a way that serves both German, both European Union and transatlantic interests? And to what extent will it be able, with its partners in the EU, to deter Russia from supporting the kind of dangerous actions that we saw last week in Minsk? And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Angela. And it opens up a whole nother discussion, of course, on the China issue, which Bob Zellick will give us. But we'll come back to questions and answers on your very good statement on Russia. Let me just note that the Q&A are being accepted. Any questions that anyone has in the Q&A. I just wanted to be sure that the audience knew that, so please feel free to use it. Let me turn now to Bob Zellick.
So thank you, Gail, and thank you for you and Jeff and your team for organizing this. It's a delight, as always, to get Angela's insights, and I'm really very pleased that Peter could spend some time with us. On the topic of China, I hope to introduce the context as I see it. I'll defer to him what Germany's going to do on that issue. But there's a nice German connection to start. In 2012, when Xi Jinping became China's leader, he commissioned a documentary film about the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War in Europe. And he directed all the party cadres to view the film. Now, if such a film had been produced in Germany, Gorbachev would have been the hero that helped end the Cold War. Well, not so the Chinese version. Gorbachev was the fool who abandoned the Communist Party, broke up his country, and led to ruin. And there was a not so subtle message. It won't happen here. Over the course of the following decade, Xi has tightened the grip of the Chinese Communist Party. He's boosted the role of the state in the economy and, importantly, centralized political power. More than any other recent Chinese leader since Mao, Xi has required subservience. There doesn't seem to be serious dissent within the Communist Party. The Chinese refer to him as the chairman of everything. Last fall, he was even got the attribution of Mao the helmsman. There's no sign of a successor, but he also seems very popular. In 2020, he launched a new party education and rectification campaign. This didn't get much attention in the US. I don't know if it did in Europe. What struck my attention was they even began an investigation of Vice President Wang Qishan's longtime former chief of staff. And that certainly signaled that everyone is vulnerable. The most recent 5-year plan expands the party's role everywhere. The theme across all topics is security, which was not really the case in prior 5-year plans. On the international side, China's strategy has proceeded on 2 tracks. One, China works within the existing order, but in doing so, it pushes for Chinese interests and norms and officials. I don't think this is a surprise. What was a surprise was the Trump administration's efforts to deconstruct the international order that the United States had helped create. But there is a second track, and that is China draws from the tradition of tributary state politics. Others can benefit as long as they defer to China, and they certainly can't criticize China. And a good example of this are all the projects related to the Belt and Road. China will use its economic links as leverage to attract, to reward, to warn, to deter, and to punish. So as Germany considers its important economic relationship, it should see this as a world of globalization with Chinese characteristics. I think the Chinese leadership now views the world with a combination of confidence, but also defensiveness. You see the phrase frequently, East rising, West declining. I think there's a blend of a Marxist-Leninist determinism, but also Chinese hubris. And at the same time, China still feels the victim. You see constant references to the Boxer Rebellion, the 150-year history. This strikes an odd note with others who are wary of Chinese power, but I think it's important to recognize this is a theme in Chinese thinking. I think the Chinese leadership are skeptical or even cynical about the developed democracies. They now believe that the United States, regardless of who's in charge, cannot accept China's rise. They feel that the United States is on a decline and struggling with internal strife. They view Tokyo with suspicion and through the historical lens. They recognize the EU's internal weaknesses, its lack of strategic capacity, and they believe they can manipulate the European Union. Now, the Biden administration inherited a strong anti-Chinese momentum, not only from the Trump administration, but this is one of the few areas where we've got a bipartisan agreement about hostility towards China. And so the Biden team doesn't want to look soft. Insofar as the rhetoric gives you guidance, Tony Blinken's phrase, I think, which has been repeated, is competitive where it should be, collaborative where it can be, adversarial where it must be. And the policy is focused on the home front first, and as Angela said more broadly, rebuilding ties with allies and partners. I would expect more of what I would describe as a Senate-style foreign policy. And you see this with Biden. Blinken spent much of his time as a staff director in the Senate. And what I mean by that is that expect statements that are designed to appeal to the audience in front of them. A good example of this is the statement about genocide. That was a very strong position. It's debated legally. It certainly hits a raw nerve. I think you'll see more of that and related to the broader human rights issues. Beyond the rhetoric, you have to look to actions. The administration has kept the tariffs in place. They've actually added some sanctions. They've kept the entity list and export controls, even added some. They've deferred a few items because of legal reasons. Some of the people on the foreign policy side, I know, were looking for some gentle exit ramps to start, but they haven't really found them yet. What I think would also be important from Germany's perspective is Biden's new multilateralism. has not included a trade policy. And so particularly there's a risk of failing to compete in Asia. The Asian economies are very hard-headed about calculating whether the United States will be committed to the Asia-Pacific region because China has the geographic and economic gravity advantage. And I think there's an open question. Is the Biden administration now laying a foundation for a future strategy with its work at home and allies, or will it simply stall with a series of tactical steps, in part because of political inhibition? There's a new conventional wisdom in the United States about China, and that is cooperation with China failed. This is factually false. I won't go into detail about proliferation issues, UN Security Council resolutions. The Chinese even helped me with Darfur, the global financial crisis stimulus, exchange rate and current account policies, frankly, even work with Taiwan and some environmental issues. But my view is the minority. And so in dealing with US policy, one has to understand the current view is cooperation didn't work. But importantly for German thinking, there's a new context in China too. This is a timely event because this month is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the CCP. In fact, I think today is the day that China will celebrate it. And as all of you know, China respects anniversaries and sees them in a symbolic terms. And Xi believes that time is on China's side. I think we'll have a China that is less willing to cooperate and negotiate, although China can be pragmatic, and where it sees national interests, it may be willing to negotiate. Importantly, there's a widening gap between the United States and China on a whole host of issues, although there should be mutual interest, whether it be climate change or biological security of the international economy. I think US policy will also have to reconcile different perspectives with its allies. It's a theme that Angela brought up in the context with Russia. The Asian aspects are especially complex. Asian partners want the United States to signal resolve. They felt they didn't see that from Obama, but they want firmness without provocation. And they certainly don't want so much cooperation that it leaves partners feeling abandoned. As for Europe, I look forward to hearing from Peter and all of you. I suspect that Europeans are nervous about China. They're troubled by the bullying and human rights, but they don't want to decouple, and they're wary of clashes driven by US politics. If I were to guess, I think the United States will try to fashion a policy that will combine deterrence, decoupling in some technology areas, competition, attention to human rights, and I hope recognition of cooperation on mutual interests. Climate change will be one. I don't know whether it will extend beyond that. Taiwan will be the hotspot, and we can discuss more of what that's involved, but there are also risks in the South China Sea and East China Sea. China's policy, maritime policy, is relying not only on the formal powers, but also fishery fleets and others. And this will be an issue that I think will be quite important in the larger security scheme of Asia over the coming years. I think the posture of Germany and the EU could be influential in how the United States combines the elements that I've discussed. I think Europeans are most likely to be effective with the United States if they recognize the changes in Xi's China that I've talked about. This is not the China of 10 years ago. There are risks and dangers, but also while cautioning against widespread decoupling, encouraging points of cooperation, and in the area of trade policy, pointing out that if the United States doesn't regain initiative, it's likely to undercut its own strategy.
Oh, there we go. Thank you very much, Bob. That was a good contribution from the other side of the world, from the Pacific. And now let's go right to Germany with Ambassador Peter Wittig and see his commentary on in response to some of these, but more specifically, what's Germany going to do? Where is it in the Pacific or in relation to Russian relationships?
Thank you, Gail and Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a joy to be with Angela and Bob on this panel. Now, you asked me to speak about the coming German policy direction or foreign policy direction. And, you know, I don't have a crystal ball. We are still at an early point of this election and almost 4 months to go. But I think it's safe to say that we'll be seeing a greening of German politics after the next elections, or I might even say even an enhanced greening of German politics. There's a strong likelihood that the Greens will take over an important role in German politics. The polls of Frau Baerbock, the leader of the Greens, have been skyrocketing. I personally believe that the leader of the Christian Democrats will really catch up and make good some ground, and that the Christian Democrats will be coming first as a party. German electors usually vote for parties and not for leaders, or vote more for parties than for leaders. So my take is that we will see a Christian Democrat-led coalition, and the two parties, the Christian Democrats and the Greens, are really ready for that partnership. Maybe if they don't garner enough support, you will have the Liberals added to that, the so-called Jamaica coalition, black, green, and yellow. But I would give it a 70% chance that a black-green or a black-green-yellow coalition will carry the day. Now, who wins? In any case, expect long and difficult negotiations to form a government. That's a tradition in Germany, a coalition treaty that takes a lot of time. Germany will be, for a couple of months, rather self-absorbed and navel-gazing. So brace for yourself for some patience after the elections. Coalition negotiations are always difficult. Now, how much will the election change Germany's international posture? First of all, don't expect great disruptions. The desire, yes, for a fresh start after 16 years of Merkel is there, but there's no desire in the German electorate to rock the boat. And anyway, foreign policy is not really the decisive factor in this election. But a black-green coalition would be probably, I would say, the most European-minded government since Helmut Kohl. Laschet, the leader of the Christian Democrats, Baerbock, the leader of the Greens, the liberals, they're all committed integrationists with strong emphasis on a strong and healthy German-French partnership and cooperation. If I exaggerate a little bit, they are all closer to Macron than to Merkel in terms of European policy approach. So we can expect, I think, from the next government a strong European, pro-European commitment and leadership. Now to transatlantic relations. Laschet is a classic transatlanticist in the Helmut Kohl tradition. The Greens are, above all, enthusiastic about Biden's climate policy. They are really applauding him, and everybody, you know, the Christian Democrats, the Greens, everybody loves Biden's emphasis on multilateralism and the new alliances. But apart from that, there's very little in the Green Party program about the US, and maybe for good reasons, but because the Greens have a more left-leaning party base. And, you know, one remark that probably is valid for all the parties, there is a sense of cautiousness vis-a-vis the developments in the US. Nobody knows how the US is headed in the future, what will happen in 22 and 24. So there is the fear that the pendulum swings back, and a kind of cautiousness, which I personally think is the wrong policy, this wait and see attitude, but it is a fact. And the Greens probably will also wait what happens in the US, but you can count on a very positive attitude towards the Biden administration. On NATO and defense, here the Greens are quite specific. On the one hand, as they write in their party program, NATO is indispensable for European security, but on the other, they carrément reject the 2% goal. They think it's a wrong approach to focus and to be fixated on the number. They agree to and they endorse German troop contributions in international conflicts, but they have to be within the system of collective security. They adamantly oppose the so-called coalition of the willings. They hail Obama's vision of global zero, and they advocate a Germany free from nuclear weapons. So you can already feel that there are fault lines here with the traditional German security policy. Laschet, of course, endorses higher defense spending. He endorses the 2% goal. So this will be a hard nut to crack in talks and agreements. On Russia, I think Angela has said it all. The discussions in Germany have been dominated by Nord Stream 2. Here, the Greens are adamantly opposed to Nord Stream 2. The chorus in the Christian Democratic Party critical of Nord Stream 2 has been rather vociferous, and has been sort of, the critical voices have been magnified by the recent events, Navalny, the military buildup of Russia against Ukraine, Lukashenko's act of piracy. In general, I would say the view on Russia has been shifting in recent months, has become more critical, and will be more critical in future, especially since the SPD is most likely not part of any future government. So human rights issues will move to the forefront with the Greens in the government. I still believe sort of the principle of the dual track approach are still valid, but we will see a shift of emphasis here. On China, this is much less of a prominent topic in German electoral politics than it is in the US. Expect some continuity of the Merkel balancing act between very strong economic interests of German industry there, and of course a green emphasis on human rights. Huawei has been sort of vanishing as a polarizing factor here because the Bundestag adopted a law basically restricting Huawei's access to critical infrastructure. I'm not so sure if the Germans realize that China policy will be one of the litmus tests of transatlantic relations. And I'm not so sure whether they want to follow the Biden administration's robust approach to China. I think they are all in favor of sort of balancing partnership and competition and rivalry, but there is a German reticence here to be enlisted in a new Cold War against China, and I see a potential of conflict in transatlantic relations here arising. A word on trade, the Greens proclaim to be in favor of multilateral global trade, but at the same time they reject the EU-Mercosur free trade agreement, and they're still critical of CETA, this very favorable free trade agreement with China. So stuff for conflict in that coalition here as well. So to conclude, Merkel will go down in post-war German history as a centrist pragmatic leader who presided over an unprecedented era of stability for Germany in a tumultuous, sometimes tumultuous world. But yet there is a certain fatigue here, an uneasiness about continuously navigating step-by-step pragmatic Merkel style. So Laschet needs to calibrate any necessary maneuver to distance himself from her to a certain extent. Merkel still is popular, but he needs at the same time to inject a new aura, or an aura of a new beginning. And for many voters, that black-green coalition is an attractive option because it gives the sense of a new beginning. In reality, this green-black coalition, if it comes about, is really already reflecting the status of Germany. Germany is already green in its mainstream, and it is at the same time rather attached to the status quo. It has, it's not very risk-friendly, and I think that equilibrium, green, but at the same time in love with all the blessings of the social security, etc. That is the kind of mixture that this future coalition will represent, in my view. Sort of a black green coalition, and that's my last remark, will not be a cozy partnership. There are many fault lines here, also in foreign policy, as I mentioned, defense, Russia, trade. Anglo-Saxons sometimes frown upon this slow-moving compromise culture of German politics, but I have to say, and I can assure everybody, it will stay with us. The fetish compromise will continue to be a signature of German politics.
Thank you very much, Peter, for very interesting remarks. And I guess my first, and I'd just like to pose one or two questions, and that is, where would be Germany's position on, if the US looking to the Pacific, and I think the expectations of the Americans are that the US is going to be looking more and more to the Pacific. Where does Germany fall in there? I mean, it seems to me it has a real, some contradictions in the degree to which it's economically very dependent on its trade. Maybe dependence too strong, but certainly looks at it very favorably. And on the other hand, of course, we have the whole question of the Uyghurs, of other human rights issues that receive a lot of attention from particularly the German public. How does Germany balance those issues? And does it follow the United States? Does it go separately? Where would it come out on that issue?
Well, Gary, I think first of all, the Germans, I don't know whether they realize, but they have to realize that for this administration, although Biden is sort of an old-fashioned NATO guy and supports the EU as an anchor of stability, but the significance of Europe for the US has diminished and will diminish even further in the future. And this is a fact that Europeans and Germans in particular have realized, and I think it should be trickling down in the coming years. And the second point is Germany. We have with strong economic interests, and they are stronger than the interests of many other countries. 40% of the sales of VW are in China, and not only the auto industry, but many other. We are an export-oriented industry, and one of the reasons why we sailed quite well through this Corona crisis is because our China business helped us to compensate for all the losses we suffered in Europe and in other markets. So this is an important, basic economic interest, not to be enlisted into a total antagonistic approach to China. On the other hand, and this is sort of the greening of the possible next government, is human rights issues will play a more important role, and also, of course, issues of this so-called rules-based international order. That means sort of caring about Chinese violations vis-a-vis the South China Sea, Hong Kong, Taiwan issue, etc. That is more important, and I think the Germans would love to calibrate this in a rational way, and not to be drawn into an entirely antagonistic approach to China. But so the chance is, and I think the opportunity is to come together on a China agenda. And I guess this will be the result of the review that is currently going on. And I think there is a chance here that we will do things together and can do things together vis-a-vis China, because that was the mistake of Trump. He did a China policy without Europe, and I think this administration will do better.
Bob, do you have something you'd like to add?
Well, let me put the context. I think the Biden administration will have sort of three fundamentals. One is what we'll call the transnational agenda. This leverages off the domestic. So this will be issues of climate, biological security, immigration. Actually, a little bit to my surprise, I think they've stumbled on this more because they're so focused on the domestic, the immigration issues, the political danger. I think they were a little slow on the biological security issue, but climate will be very significant. And that, as Peter mentioned, that creates a basis for building closer ties with Europe. And I think while there's the second and third issues are the rise of China, and third, the future of free societies. And I put those together because I think there's some thinking in the US that Europe could be a very important partner on those three issues, even though there's, as you probably point out, a shift of focus on the Pacific. I think the challenge will be whether Europe develops a strategic concept. And people have discussed this for many times. And at least when I listened to Peter, I wouldn't expect Germany to play a leadership role in that. Insofar as a strategic concept, it'll be related to European integration. So I can see some tensions on that. And of course, on the US side, there's also going to be a challenge of how effectively the United States can develop a strategic concept. I think for the German audience, it's particularly important to recognize Biden has a huge domestic agenda. And even though he's experienced and interested in international affairs, this is going to preoccupy. I mean, he's going to be spending more time over the next few weeks on the infrastructure bill and reconciliation than he is on some of the topics that we've discussed here. But there's a question that I've seen come up that connected this, which is we've discussed Russia and China separately. Well, what about Russia and China together here? And I think to start on this, my own sense from still some ties with the Russia and Chinese strategic communities is they're both a little skeptical of one another. They see this as a tactical maneuver. The Russians don't believe that China is going to be their big brother for the great future, and the Chinese are a little disparaging of what they see in Russia. On the other hand, I think that part of Macron's policy, and there will be people in the US that say, can we somehow develop a more constructive track with Russia, given the longer term strategic challenge of China. I would point to Angela's most recent book. I think this is going to be hard. I think Putin is kind of set in his course, and I think it's unlikely that we're going to see any significant shift. However, I do think if countries are playing for the long term, they will want to keep some ties with Russia's society to see what happens afterwards. But I think the key point that I want to emphasize is I think there's actually a more significant opportunity here with Europe, but it depends on Germany's perspective. And at least from what Peter says, and I have no reason to doubt that, I think the US is likely to feel somewhat disappointed.
Mm.
Gail,
Yes,
can I come in on the Russia-China part of this?
Yes, and especially because we have a question from the audience exactly to that. So
Right.
please, would you?
Thanks. Yeah, I saw the question, and just to add a little bit to what Bob was saying, part of the question was, have things been done to drive Russia and China closer together? And I would argue during the Trump administration, the kind of dual policies of a trade war with China and these rafts of sanctions on Russia have driven them closer together. This current phase in 2014, when the West tried to isolate Russia after Crimea and the Chinese stepped in. They signed the major gas deal with Russia, and you do see the two countries, as was in the question, really growing closer together, more joint military maneuvers in parts of the world where they haven't done it before. Again, I agree completely with Bob. There's a degree of cynicism there. If you talk to Chinese experts on Russia about how Russia organizes itself, I would say they're very skeptical. But at the moment, from the point of view of the people in the Kremlin, China is really, it's an existential question for them. Xi Jinping says that Putin's his best friend. Even if you discard extravagant rhetoric, the Chinese are never going to criticize the Russians for what they do domestically. And of course, vice versa is the same. So there has been the idea, both in the Trump administration and now in the Biden administration, that things should be done to try and persuade Russia that it should distance itself from China. But in my opinion, the kind of concessions, if you like, that either Germany or Europe or the US would have to make in order to persuade Russia of this would go against, at least until now, everything that we've agreed to do. The primary one being to say to Russia, yes, the post-Soviet space, is your legitimate sphere of influence, and we'll give you a free hand there. So I would say, in the longer run, clearly there are huge asymmetries here. Russia and China aren't natural partners, et cetera, et cetera. But for the time being, and for the current inhabitant of the Kremlin, who could be there until 2036, the bet has been made that it's better to be the junior partner to China than it is to the US.
And would you, we have one related question there, or sort of two that overlapped, that question then whether of closer transatlantic alliance and policy toward both of these would somehow be helpful or not so helpful?
You mean if there was a more coordinated transatlantic policy?
And he mentions in particular some maritime exercises and all. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think in principle, yes. But I think particularly vis-a-vis China, and we've already heard that from both Bob and Peter, it's going to be difficult to get that kind of coordination.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody, Peter, do you want to come back?
Just to add to that, one point I want to draw out, and I totally agree with the way Angela phrased it. What I would say to a European audience is, I think there's a fluidity towards how the Biden administration actually shapes these elements. I think they've kind of found themselves in a posture. They're trying to position somewhat different from Trump, but they're wary of the politics. And Kirk Campbell, for example, who's the director of this, said, the era of engagement is over. But I think if Europe had a cohesive view about relations with China, where it recognized some of the dangers, the the fact that the Chinese policies on globalization are different than they might have been 10 years ago, if they realize some of the security issues, I think Europe could influence the mix of US cooperation with China. I mean, you could see this even in the attitude towards the pipeline policy that Biden, in a sense, opted to have a better relationship with Germany than follow his own preference. I think there would be aspects of that in the Asia context too. My concern is that the European/German approach to China is going to be more fragmented based on different interest groups. But so on the larger transatlantic issue, I just underscore that sometimes it's made it, the perspective is, oh, the US is all focusing on Asia Pacific. I think that misses a possibility with Europe, but others can judge better whether Europe will play that role.
Thank you. Let me come back to Angela and Peter for our last one. Unfortunately, we're right toward the end. But let me ask you something that's coming up, and that is this meeting in Geneva between Putin and Biden. And if you had to recommend something that would be a lead to a more constructive engagement between the two, maybe or even Germany making the suggestion, what issue or couple of issues would you suggest? Angela, do you want to start, and maybe Peter will be back in? But I think it could also be on the telephone. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are a number of issues that they say they're going to discuss. One of them clearly will be a continuation of the sort of arms control strategic stability track, which I think is very important for Germany too. And that is to say, can the US and Russia, resume regular strategic stability talks, which would involve confidence building measures? I mean, we're in a situation where, the rhetoric about the possibility of war, you get that from Russia, on all of the main talk shows all the time. All right, you can put some of that aside, but there is a heightened atmosphere of tension now. And I think that's definitely felt in a country like Germany. So that is something where, they'll also be talking about how they might approach the follow-on. We have New START now, which will be there till 2026. But how do you think about what happens after that? I do think from the US point of view, the cyber interference is a very important topic. I mean, we've seen it again and again, most recently hacking into the USAID, the State Department. The Russians have said for some time they want to sit down and have talks with the US about a roadmap. The US has been very skeptical about that until now, but we'll see. That will certainly be one of the issues. And then I think there are regional issues which have been mentioned: Syria, North Korea, the US pulling out of Afghanistan, where Russia also has great concerns. So I think all of that will be there, and no doubt there will also be a discussion of what's happening inside Russia. In terms not only of Navalny, but just in general, the greater repression there. So it's a very large menu. They'll have maybe a day, and we'll see how much they can accomplish.
Peter, are you with us?
Yes, I am, but the connection is less stable than before. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
I would follow Angela's lead and say, the agenda should comprise disarmament, and nuclear disarmament is important also for Europe. We have an interest in discussing, that the two powers discuss the INF issue and also the short range nuclear weapons. Cyber interference, extremely important in the run-up of various European elections, and the message should be very clear to the Russians: hands off from interfering, via proxies or directly in our elections. Ukraine should be an important issue. I think this last maneuver, this last military threat by the Russians was totally unacceptable, and here maybe the US is pondering about a more active role, certainly a different role than the Trump administration played. And there are signs that you know, the US is also caring more about Ukraine and the whole complex of Navalny, etc. It was Chancellor Merkel who basically invited the dying Navalny to come to Germany. So this is a big issue in our country as well. And I would repeat, I think the German approach to Russia has been deprived of any illusions or many illusions what can be done with Putin's Russia. So there is a much more sober assessment of the way forward. In a way, it's a sort of a disillusionment of the dual track approach. But Germans would still cling to that idea that you've got to continue talking to Russia, although the hopes that we harbor are very thin.
Thank you so much. And I would just put in too, which is often overlooked, is the role of Germany in Lithuania under the enhanced forward presence. I mean, I think that does show very strongly where Germany stands too. So let me thank everyone on behalf of AICGS and of myself for your being here, for your hearing the comments, and thank the speakers in particular, Angela, Bob, Peter, so much for taking this time from all parts of the world. Angela and I are here in DC, but Bob is in Arizona and Peja is in Greece. So happy rest of your vacation. And again, thank you so much. And thanks also for, of course, AICGS and for Eric's very good election series. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.